I'm Frank Abe. I'm a writer and editor living in Seattle. I'm also a third generation Japanese American, known as the Sansei generation or third generation, the baby boomers born just after World War II and who came of age in the 60s and 70s. So with Floyd Chung of Smith College, I edited this new anthology for Penguin Classics called The Literature of Japanese American Incarceration. Uh, and what is so interesting is that Penguin Classics publishes anthologies contextualizing important historical periods for a modern audience. And ours is like a roadmap, providing a big picture and making all the parts of the experience accessible to teachers who can supplement it then with their own localized or personal books and films. I think Floyd Chung has broken down the contents of the book himself, but what what the book does, it reclaims and reframes what I like to call the collective voice of a people who must all respond to a succession of adverse actions and administrative edicts taken against them by their own government. It's often common to think of this, if people learn about this at all, as, oh, an injustice, people taken away from their homes, put in these camps for 3 years, and had terrible food and bad weather. It's much more detailed than that. And the book shows the succession of events from exclusion, then detention, then incarceration in permanent camps. Then the government belatedly administers a loyalty questionnaire after it's already stripped people of their freedoms and property. And then uh, it, it segregates people based on the results of that loyalty questionnaire. Then it drafts young men from the camps. Then the government offers voluntary renunciation of American citizenship to those in the segregation camp, which is the trap of self-deportation to Japan. So the literature of incarceration that we present is captures that whole experience. And what's interesting is that our editor wanted to include the government documents, the government edicts I mentioned, in the book. And I resisted that idea at first because I wanted to have it all just be Japanese Americans writing. But what's interesting is that by presenting the government orders in full, in some cases, it provides the villain of the book, as it were. The government is seen for what it was, which is the antagonist, the the body that was throwing all the barriers in front of our people, which they had to overcome, and the writing then captures those efforts. Um, I like to say that the collection is pointed rather than poignant, in that this is not the greatest hits of Japanese American writing. Rather, it is little known works that have been buried in the archives, neglected on the shelf, or really hidden in the uh, concealed in the Japanese language writings that were written in camp, that we had no access to because one of the long-term effects of incarceration for me and my generation was that we never a distancing of ourselves from the Japanese language and culture because of the stigma that carried that put our parents' generation in camp. So what the volume does is we include like 14 different translations of works writings from the Japanese into English, including two new translations that we commissioned, and it opens up this voice of our grandparents' generation, the Issei, our immigrant generation, and their emotional writing that has not been much seen before because it was, again, in Japanese and no one bothered to translate it. Uh, what also is interesting is the idea of what is literature. We define it not as fine writing or the belles lettres, but the any writing in camp, whether it was a letter, a diary, or a memoir. And this opens up again a range of experience. All these books behind me you see, I I basically drew the selections from writings I had collected over the last 40 years. 40 years. Um, in the 1970s, when I was first starting out, I was buying these hardcover books of the Kikuchi Diaries or the Derelicts of Company K, a memoir of Hawaiians in the MIS, which I couldn't afford these books for one thing, but and I didn't understand why I was buying them, but I knew there was something important inside them that I wanted to understand and save and understand later. Fortunately, this anthology now gives me a chance to kind of put all these selections. I've been dragging these books around with me for 40 years into a cohesive collection that is arranged again chronologically, so that all the selections make sense. There is, and I knew a lot of these folks too. Hiroshi Kashiwagi, the poet, uh, the Mrs. Akutsu. I knew Jim Akutsu, the draft resistor from Minidoka. His mother's letter is in the anthology, a letter where a Japanese-speaking immigrant wife of a cobbler in Seattle is writing to the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, begging her to release her husband from an enemy alien internment camp where he'd been sent after Pearl Harbor, just so he can rejoin the family in their own prison camp, which was the Puyallup Fairgrounds. Um, uh, and the letter actually was successful because after being away from the family for 2 years, Mrs. Akutsu wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, and the letter may have had some result in having her husband sent back shortly after. So these are the kinds of things that um, we present in the anthology, and I hope that again it provides a roadmap for educators to um, see the whole arc of the Japanese American incarceration experience in a way that answers all their questions for themselves and their students, and can provide a framework for the teaching of this experience, which they can then supplement with their own, perhaps local stories or a favorite book or film that they know. Uh, what's when I finally got the book in my hands and leafed through it, I was really surprised to see that um, the way the 68 selections hang together is that there's a consistency of tone across all these authors, because again, these are people who shared the same experience of mass exclusion and incarceration based solely on the race that they shared with a wartime enemy. Many of them had very little else in common, had a wide range of backgrounds, but they all shared the same experience of being imprisoned based on their race. And so that is a consistency of tone throughout the volume of people. And I think the selections that we chose instinctively or intuitively were those of people pushing back against injustice, pushing back against the government that had imprisoned them, pushing back against the sense of betrayal by their other fellow prisoners in many cases. And so the collective voice is one that emerges from the anthology, and that I think was the biggest surprise for me in seeing the finished volume. I'm pleased that we could bring out, pieces that have not been seen or little seen, and include, I think, the foundational documents of the Japanese American incarceration experience, which are, the 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 manifesto, the Fair Play Committee in response to the draft from camp, the manifesto of the Seattle Evacuation Redress Committee, written by Shosuke Sasaki, which clearly lays out the case for redress and reparations and a government apology 40 years after the fact, um, and which I think laid the foundation for that whole successful campaign for redress. And then, bringing the literature to the present, where we can see a continued othering of people in America today based on their race or their religion or their immigration status or their gender identity. People continue to be marginalized in this country based on their differences, and the as I conclude the volume, until the day that changes, the literature of Japanese American incarceration is one that will continue to be written.